So, Jan and Jillian, I'm so excited to have you. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
I am so excited to talk to you because this topic is so important for people of all walks of life, even for myself and teaching my daughter, because we're going to talk about boundaries today. So, if you could tell me a little bit about your journey and how you became relationship and conflict resolution consultants.
Yeah, so we grew up in a really small town of 900 people and moved to a metropolitan city of 3 million. So that was a huge culture shock for us. And then we went on to undergrad and then started volunteering at a crisis hotline where we worked with kids who ran away from home and would mediate between the parents and the teens and do some conflict resolution and figure out how to get the teen back home and be able to maintain that family dynamic that was healthy and keep the kids safe. And so then we went on to get our graduate degree in psychology and then became certified family mediators as well.
And through our whole journey of moving from a rural farm town to a metropolitan city, we quickly learned it was a culture shock for us where we did not have boundaries and we needed to learn them quick. And then we developed our boundary badass formula in operating our first entrepreneurial business.
That is amazing. And I can only imagine what it was like to go from such a difference in communities. I never experienced that, but I did go from Catholic school, which we had like 12 kids in our class, like up until almost middle school. And then I switched to public school. And even just that switch was so difficult. And I feel like when I was younger, you don't think about boundaries, but I love that it kind of led you on the path where you are now, and that is what you are helping people with.
Yeah, I don't think we ever knew this was going to be our path, but it just life just kind of took us in that direction. And we just realized that we had this innate desire to really help others find their voice and elevate their life and relationships and really honor their boundaries. So.
But I think too, nowhere in life does anyone really teach boundaries. You don't necessarily learn them in the home and you don't learn them in school, or even effective communication. So I think it's a learning curve we all have to go through at some point.
Yeah. And what is the most important thing that you think people need to know about boundaries?
That everyone starts somewhere in that, but they are essential and we do need them for every type of relationship we have, whether it is with, a family member, a child, a colleague, just anyone in our life. When we have those boundaries, it allows our relationships to thrive and maintain that mutual respect and self-respect.
Yeah, it's really, really important. And like you said, the term boundary it's a big one because you have to have so many different kinds with different people. Like you said, workplace versus home versus children. Like it's so different, but it's underneath it all. It's very, very similar. I would love to know what you feel happens when you do and do not have boundaries set up.
I think when we don't have boundaries in our lives, what happens is we can find ourselves in situations where others take advantage of us, and we can, especially if we have that people pleaser mentality and we start to extend all of our energy externally to other people in terms of helping them. And then the relationship with ourselves starts to deteriorate. And then we don't feel so good with ourselves, or we find ourselves in relationships where people might take advantage of us and they might be somewhat toxic in personality type. And so we can find ourselves in that dynamic if we don't have boundaries or we're not voicing our value, that we can find ourselves very burnt out, drained, emotionally distressed on a regular basis. So it's really important that we establish boundaries.
Do you find that people pleasers tend to have a harder time establishing boundaries?
Yes, or avoidance. So it's wherever their voice was usually not validated or heard during their childhood years, that they can have a much tougher time setting boundaries in their adult relationships. I think people pleasers often sometimes feel guilty because usually a parent or caregiver would make them feel like they weren't important and that parent needed to have the center of attention or be the person who, got all
Authoritarian within the home is like my
Yeah.
way or the highway type mentality.
Yeah, so I think a lot of times people pleasers can feel guilty, they can feel like they're responsible for others, and they're also fearful to lose connections if they speak up. But if we speak up in a way that allows both people to have a voice in that boundary establishment for the relationship, then it's much likely to feel much easier. So I think the difference between relationship boundaries or trauma informed boundaries is very the way you approach it is just a different style. And I think when people pleasers learn how to set it from a we mindset or relationship perspective, it's much easier to speak up.
Right, because both parties end up benefiting, right, if they're done the right way versus
Right.
people pleasers, and I am one, so I totally get it. Like you're always worried about, you actually, in my perspective, you put the energy off yourself and you're sending it to everyone else and being like, what are they going to think? I have to make this person happy. And you forget about yourself. It's like that two-way street is not there. You're just externalizing everything. So I love how you worded that with that kind of like that two-way street, that it benefits other people as well as benefiting yourself.
Yeah, I think it simultaneously is about self-respect and mutual respect, because we're promoting growth within the relationship while still addressing our needs and what it is that we need in order to continue that relationship in a way that feels good to us.
Yeah. What is the biggest lesson that you learned when you started setting boundaries?
The biggest lesson we learned is to set boundaries from a place of value rather than emotion. And I think a lot of times out there, and I probably helped since we developed our method in terms of running our business, because you can't really operate a business from, well, some people do, but you shouldn't really operate business from an emotional place. So we really focused in on using our values as our guiding principles in order to get our needs met. Because when someone's crossing our limits, there's going to be an emotional trigger or experience that we're going to feel. Like we might feel ignored, dismissed, disrespected. The opposite of that emotional trigger is actually our value that we need met, such as communication, the mutual respect, or integrity or loyalty. And when we operate from our values, the other person is more likely to receive the boundary from a positive place of willing to work with us, because values are universally understood, where emotions are often one-sided projections that get displaced onto a connection, and that can be confusing for the other person to understand where you're coming from. So we're more likely to be heard and understood when we set boundaries from a place of value rather than emotion.
Now, what happens if you set a boundary, right? You're starting the process, everyone's listening to this podcast, they're going to look at all of your stuff and actually start taking steps to set boundaries. What happens if they set a boundary and it isn't received well? How can they go about dealing with that?
So then that's when our discovery questions come really in handy, which are open-ended questions that allow you to gain farther insight. So you would say, can you help me understand if this is a good time to talk? Or can you share what about that boundary doesn't feel good to you? And so you're opening up the conversation to further understand why they may be feeling frustrated or why they're being reactive to you in regards to that boundary. But then at the same time, you could just say, it seems like this maybe isn't a good time. How about we break and talk about this at another time too, to protect yourself if you're feeling uneasy or threatened in that situation.
That's a fantastic tip. That was so good. I love that.
Yeah.
Now, what is the most common thing that prevents people from setting or maintaining boundaries?
I think the biggest thing is that people fear the reaction of the other person. And rather than fearing the other person, we need to focus on expressing our inner voice and our needs from a place that allows us to respect ourselves. So if we always are going to fear the other person's reaction, then we're inadvertently giving that person permission to have power over us within the dynamic. And so we need to think of boundaries as a natural need in life, just like we need water to stay alive and quench our thirst. We need boundaries in order to survive in our relationships and protect our own inner peace and well-being as well.
Yeah, it's essential to our peace and our harmony with ourselves and other people. Do you find that there's one thing that people should keep in mind when they're struggling to maintain those boundaries?
I think this is where honoring your own value system on a day-to-day basis can help you align to your inner truth and values. And so if you're having a tough time, think about your top 5 values and how can you live and operate by them on a day-to-day basis? Because if you aren't able to live according to your values, it's going to be much harder for people to respect what it is that you need when you do go set a boundary, because we haven't been committed to who we are as a person first. And so when you honor that value system, it's much easier to get back on track if you feel like you're struggling. And then have some value alignment exercises. So just like we do positive affirmations, you could do value alignment. So statements where you could do like, I value communication. And so today, we're having this conversation on the podcast and we're honoring communication. We're having an authentic way of communicating with each other. So that's a way of saying I value communication, and I'm honoring it today in a way that honors that value in my own life. So,
And it's one of those things too that might take time, right? Like people might start and then take a few steps back and start again. Do you feel like once people start, it gets easier to establish and maintain the boundaries?
Yes, I think once it's just kind of like riding a bike. You might fall down a few times, but eventually, if you want to reach your goal, you're going to keep getting back on that bike and you're going to keep trying until you're able to pedal off on your bike. So, same thing with boundaries. Is any new skill is that it does take a little bit of practice sometimes, and we have to keep trying, and eventually it just gets easier with time and becomes like second nature.
Yeah. And I know you wrote a book and it's an international best-selling book. So I want to hear more.
So our book is Boundary Badass, and it's a powerful method for elevating your value and relationships. And so the first 10 chapters are all about sort of self-development, understanding child psychology, and how if there's any unhealed childhood wounds that may be playing out in your own life, and some interpersonal psychology, but really understanding who you are as a person and where maybe some of your triggers are, that you may experience in some of your relationships, and understanding how your triggers are connected to your values. And then the chapters 10 through 28, each chapter is dedicated to a different type of boundary that you may want to establish in your life, and goes on and establishes the method and the types of boundaries you could set.
Wow, that's fascinating. Is there a specific type of boundary that you find people have a harder time setting or that people aren't really as aware of?
I think people have a harder time setting boundaries potentially with family, especially if there's generational dysfunction or trauma that has gone on and their voice has been like silenced or dismissed, no matter how many times they've tried to maybe address something that they're not okay with. Breaking that pattern can be very challenging. And so sometimes, even if you do try to set a boundary with complex personalities, sometimes they're not willing to listen to you. They're not willing to break this generational power dynamic. And so sometimes we have to redefine what your boundaries look like and how much time you're willing to spend with that family member if they're not willing to respect your boundaries.
Yeah, it's hard when I see this with a lot of my clients. When you try to start establishing boundaries and start to take care of yourself and your energy, and as you're trying, the people around you aren't used to it. They're like, what is going on? You might face some backlash, or there are a lot of misunderstandings, or you feel guilty. Like a lot of them feel guilty and they don't want to, they fear pushing someone out of their life. But it's hard because they feel like sometimes as they go through it, it's like they just tune into what they really need. And the more they start establishing like how they feel and what they need over time, they'll figure out what boundary to set and how it's gonna play out in the long run. But it's really hard for situations like that, and where you're dealing with family members and you can't leave them alone. You can't move away from them. You're stuck in this house with the same people. So I'm sure that's really, really hard.
Well, and that's where sometimes you have to define your own personal limits for yourself, and you might just need to call a timeout, or you might need to say, hey, like this conversation isn't healthy, like we just need to take a pause and come back at it at a later date. So I think knowing your own personal limits is really important too, besides just setting boundaries with others, individuals within the home or family dynamics, from extended family members. But yeah, it's one of those things, like if we don't set the boundary though, then we have to ask ourselves, like, what is our happiness worth? Like, how come our needs are not important? Or what about us as an individual doesn't deserve to be like seen or heard or valued? And so the more we stay silent, it sort of plummets our self-esteem. And so we need to go back to really truly owning our worth.
Yeah, it's going back to yourself and like really tuning into yourself and your needs and your value and your worth. I love that. Do you have a favorite tip from your book that you want to share? I know there's probably so many, but one juicy one.
I think when people go through the book, they're going to have a lot of aha moments that make sense to them in terms of coming full circle, not only with things that they've experienced growing up, but also in their current relationships. So the goal was to help people, really understand that almost every single person out there has struggled with boundaries at some point in time. And so there's relatable content throughout the whole entire book. But yeah, I think the biggest aha thing is realizing that you do have a voice, your voice is valuable, and really honing in on your value system is going to allow you to express yourself in a way where others are going to respect you.
It's amazing that you help so many people establish this because it is so, so important. And I think oftentimes boundaries are overlooked or they're not understood. And so, yeah, I think just bringing that awareness and helping people through the amazing information in your book is just incredible.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Our approach is definitely different. I think a lot of people out there have been taught to set more trauma-informed boundaries, which are more unilateral, or they can be demands, such as if you don't do X, I'm going to do Y. So it places a conditional term on that relationship, and more than likely the other person is not going to meet your needs, or if they do, it's only temporarily, and then they're going to revert back to their old behaviors. So our method is all about trying to bridge the gap in perspective and really bring the relationship together so that way we could create greater trust and transparency and respect. And so there is a negotiation process that occurs, but that's so we can fully understand all different perspectives and how we find that middle ground so each person feels respected and valued.
That's amazing. That's incredible. I want to dive into the spirit segment. And I would love to know, what is one thing you always include in your daily routine that helps you stay spiritually grounded and balanced that might help other people do the same?
I would say that I definitely maintain doing some like self-care and self-love. I'm always really honing into my spirit and doing some reflecting along the way in terms of whether it's deep belly breathing and just sitting in silence, and going for a walk in nature. A lot of times I think being in nature can really help us reflect on like who we are, what it is that is important to us, because we aren't around distractions or computers or phones. And so I think just being able to be present with yourself is really crucial to honing into your own spirituality.
Yeah. And even taking that time when the distractions aren't there, when you're walking in nature or sitting by yourself in your room listening to music, and just like you mentioned, like tuning into your own needs, your own energy, your own body, your values, and using that time just to self-reflect.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite story regarding your connection to spirit?
I feel like in regards to spirit, well, I feel like our biggest connection to spirit would be somebody who is now a spirit. Our grandmother has passed, and she was our biggest inspiration in life growing up. And she always believed in us and always was there for us and like taught us how to read. And so like, unfortunately she's already passed, but I wish she could have seen that we actually like wrote a book. So she's always, I feel like, but we're always getting like signals from her that she's always still with us.
I was going to say, so many times they leave us here on earth, but they will always send those signs. Now, totally off topic, not really, but did you ever, like, throughout your life, did you think I'm going to write a book, or did it kind of just
No.
no? Because I'm like, she probably knows that you wrote this book. She knows you loved your reading, and I'm sure she had some impact on that and the fact that you guys actually did it and it was so successful.
Yeah, I think too, what's funny is like I wasn't a huge like avid reader, excuse me, an avid reader even as a kid growing up. And so like now I love reading books and learning from them and applying them and stuff. And like our book, the reason why we really wrote it is too, because we wanted to give people like something that was applicable that they could actually implement, not just like read it and process it and learn, but they could actually put something into use in real life. And I think being able to help more people, is always something that was something our grandmother did, was always kindness and helping people. And so I think just being able to know that we can touch more lives is really important to us too.
And we obviously being twins and working together, writing a book together, we still have like our sisterly moments, of course, being always together. But I can hear our grandmother in the back of our head. Now, girls, if you don't have anything nice to say, then don't say anything at all.
And so I just heard, I got this download, and the download is from your grandmother. So I got chills on my shoulder. To when you get off this podcast recording, you're gonna pick a book, flip a page, just a random page. So before you do that, you're gonna say, please give me a message. Flip to a page, and then you're gonna read it and see what comes up for you.
Okay.
Okay. Now, what is one final piece of advice that you have for listeners who are trying to improve their spiritual well-being?
I think taking time for yourself, looking within. I think so many people often look for messages outside of themselves, but when it really comes to truly healing and having that personal alignment or professional alignment, it really takes that time of looking within and asking yourself, like, what do I need and what's going to make me be fulfilled in life?
Yeah, yeah, huge. Amazing tip. It's a simple tip, but it's so powerful. Like, that is so powerful.
Yeah, I think we get stronger when we look within.
Yeah, 100%. It's like, and then when we do that, we start really tuning into that like intuition within us. And then the more you do it, the stronger it gets, right? So yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah. Our intuition is very powerful, and it's one thing I truly believe in listening to. Because the times I haven't listened to it, it has definitely been hurtful. So I think it's always one of those strongest emotions that we need to listen to because it can truly guide us in the best direction possible.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
Where could our listeners go to learn more about you guys?
They can either find us on IG at Jan and Jillian or janandjillian.com, and they can grab our book at Amazon, Boundary Badass.
Awesome, awesome. Now, before we stop, I pulled a card for you guys to describe the energy between you, as well as a message for everyone else who's listening. So are you ready for the card?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. You guys got the Daughter of Wands, which is this beautiful energy. And on this card specifically, it's a silhouette of a woman with these fireworks. I don't know if you just saw the light flicker, fireworks, right? And it's all about, for me, what I took from it was how you help people transform their mindset and learn to establish those boundaries so that they can step into their power and feel more energetic as well.
Yep, that sounds about right. Our
That's
goal
awesome.
is definitely help people honor their own innate power.
Yeah, it was like perfect when I saw it. I was like, ah, amazing. And the message for everyone else who's listening is it's a reminder to embody your emerging power, to feel more confident within yourself, and to show off your talents and your creativity. So Jan and Jillian, I am honored that you guys came on, and I appreciate you sharing all of those tips and that guidance and really reflecting on everyone's individual value system and how that can help them establish boundaries. So thank you so much for being here.
Yes, thanks
Thanks
for
for having
having us.